She was the youngest at the auction. A 60-year-old rancher insisted he'd wait. The lot number was 47. I know because I had it written on the back of my hand with a carpenter's pencil, the number smeared some from where I'd wiped sweat off my palm before the bidding started. I wasn't there for her. I want to say that plain, right at the front, because the rest of this is going to sound like I had a plan and I didn't. I was there for a parcel of creek-bottom grazing land that Harlan Dietz had run cattle on for 11 years before his lungs gave out. And I had been watching that parcel since the spring thaw when I noticed the fencing along the south draw was his and not the county's. Good fencing. Cedar posts, double-wrapped wire, corners braced the right way, the kind a man builds when he means to stay. Whoever bought that land was getting 11 years of labor along with the deed, and I had a use for it. Good grass on the bench above the draw, water in the creek 10 months out of 12, and a natural windbreak on the north side that would keep cattle settled through the worst months. I had been planning for that land since April, and I knew what it was worth. She was lot 46. I didn't know that going in. The auction sheet they'd handed out in front of the Dietz barn listed the parcels by number, and I hadn't paid much attention past the land section. I'd folded the sheet in my jacket pocket, and I never opened it past page 2. The parcels were what I'd come for, and I had the numbers I needed in my head, and I wasn't there to look at horses. There were maybe 60 people standing in that packed dirt yard under the August heat. It sat on all of us like a wool blanket, that kind of dry, still August heat you get in the valley when there's no wind off the mountains and the sky goes white instead of blue. Most of the men had their hats off and were using them. The women who'd come were standing in what shade there was under the east side of the barn, and there wasn't much. The auctioneer was a man named Colfax who wore a string tie and had been calling lots for 30 years, and you could hear it. The enthusiasm had worn down to something better, which was a kind of professional honesty. He didn't oversell. He said what a thing was and let the bidding find the number. I respected that about him. Most men who do that job long enough turn into performers. Colfax had gone the other way, he just called it. When she walked out with the 3 horses, a matched pair of roan mares and a gray gelding with a good hip, I thought for a moment she worked for the estate. She had on a plain blue dress and her hair was pulled back and she was carrying a lead rope coiled over her shoulder like she'd just come in from the pasture. She looked at the crowd the way a person looks at weather, taking stock. Not afraid, not comfortable, somewhere more useful than either of those, alert. Maybe 22, 23 years old. Dark eyes that moved over the yard in a way that wasn't random. She wasn't looking at the crowd the way a nervous person looks at a crowd, picking at faces for reassurance or threat. She was reading it. Methodical and quiet, a kind of stillness to her that you don't often see in someone that young, the kind of stillness that comes from having had to be still when it was necessary, not from being placid. Then Colfax said, Lot 46, 4-piece offering, 3 head of good working stock and 1 indenture, terms as listed on page 2 of your sheet. And I understood. Harlan Dietz had died owing money. Not a ruinous amount, but enough that his estate, which had nobody to settle it except a distant nephew in Missouri who'd sent a letter but not himself, had bundled what it could. The horses were worth bidding on. The indenture was a 2-year domestic service contract, and it existed because the girl's father had owed Harlan money going back some years, and the debt had transferred when the man died, and the estate was recovering what it could. I got the particulars later. What I knew standing there in that August heat was that she was being sold alongside 3 horses and nobody in that yard seemed to think much of it. The horses were the main event, and she was the afterthought bundled in. Colfax read the terms in about 4 sentences and moved on to the bidding. The lot opened at $60. I hadn't planned to bid. I had $15 left after setting aside what I needed for the creek bottom parcel, and $15 wasn't enough to compete for 3 good horses. I stood in the shade of the barn eave and I watched. There were 4 men bidding serious. A sheep rancher named Galt who ran land east of the picket wire, a younger man I didn't know who had the look of someone buying for another party, a horse trader from Walsenburg I recognized by face, and a feed merchant from town named Aldrich who wanted the roans. You could see it in the set of his shoulders when they walked out, and was willing to pay for them. She stood with the horses through the whole thing. I watched her watch the bidding. She never took her eyes off whoever was currently holding the high bid, and she held each one for a few seconds and then moved to the next, deciding something, I don't know exactly what, maybe which one she'd rather work 2 years for. Maybe something harder and more private than that. The horse trader dropped out at 90. Aldrich dropped out at 100 and looked unhappy about it. It came down to Galt and the younger man, and they went back and forth in $5 steps, and at 110 the younger man shook his head and stepped back. Galt said, "Done." He said it before Colfax finished the fall, the sound of a man who'd bought what he expected to buy. She looked at Galt for about 4 seconds. Flat and even the way you look at something you need to understand entirely before you can move on. Then she looked at me. I don't know why she looked at me. I was standing at the back of the crowd in the shade of the barn eave, and I hadn't made a single bid, and there was nothing about me in that moment that should have drawn her eye. I'm a big man, and maybe the shade made me more visible than the crowd in the glare. Or maybe she'd been reading the whole yard in pieces, one man at a time, working from left to right, and I was simply the last one she got to. I looked back, I didn't look away. Colfax said, "Sold to." 115, I said. The whole yard turned around, including Galt, including Colfax, including her. I had no idea where the money was going to come from. I had $63 and some change in my front pocket, and another 12 in my boot, and a horse outside worth maybe 40 if you found the right buyer on the right day. I was short by about $40 on what I'd just committed to in front of 60 people. Galt stared at me for a long moment. He was not used to being outbid on anything. There was a way he carried himself, the stance, the set of the jaw, the particular patience of a man who's been the biggest bidder in the room for so long he's forgotten it's possible not to be. That said, he considered most things settled before they were offered. He said, 120. I said 130. I don't know if you've ever bid money you don't have on something you didn't plan to buy. It has a specific feeling. Like stepping off a roof in the dark, not knowing if the ground is 2 feet down or 20. My mouth was dry and my heart was going and I was very calm. That's the particular thing about being 60 years old. You've stepped off enough roofs in the dark that the falling doesn't change your breathing anymore. You've learned that the ground comes up or it doesn't and your breathing has nothing to do with it either way. You just do the thing. Galt looked at me the way men look at each other when they're deciding if this is going to go further. I held his eye and didn't fill the silence with anything. After a long moment he shook his head, once, slow, like a man putting down something mildly irritating, and turned away. 130, Colfax said. Sold. Then I had to figure out how to pay for 3 horses, and a woman's contract with $63, 12 in my boot, and a horse. I went to find Walker Price, who ran the Dietz estate paperwork from a folding table set up in the shade of a cottonwood at the far edge of the yard. He had ledgers and a money box, and a lot of patience for a man doing this in August heat. I told him what I had on me and told him about the horse and told him I'd been planning to bid on the creek bottom parcel, lot 47, the land with Dietz's good fencing, but I was giving that up now. I asked if he'd take a note on the $7 remaining and let me bring it by end of month. He looked at me for a while. Walker Price had known me 11 years, since I first came to the valley with 40 head of cattle and a wagon and a determination to build something in this country. In 11 years, I had never missed a debt, never reneged on a handshake, never needed anyone to come to me twice. He knew that the way you know things about a man you've dealt with honestly for 11 years. He wrote the note himself and slid it across the table, and I signed it, and he initialed it and put it in the ledger, and he said, "The horses are yours and so is the contract. Have her report to your place by end of week." She was standing 15 feet away the whole time. She heard all of it. When I walked back to where she was waiting, the lead rope still coiled over her shoulder, she said, "What do you need done?" Not a question, a transaction. She wanted the terms stated before she agreed to anything else. I said, "Right now I need you to help me load 3 horses into a trailer, because I only came with one." She looked at me for a moment in that flat measuring way. Then she said, "I can do that," and she went and got the roans. Her name was Calla Marsh. I learned it on the drive back to the ranch, the 3 roans shifting in the trailer behind us and the gray gelding tied to the fence slats and not happy about it. She told me her story in about 4 sentences, the way you tell things that happened to you and not because of you. Her father had borrowed money from Harlan Dietz 6 years before to buy seed corn during a bad drought year. The debt had accrued because the corn came in poor 2 years running, and then her father died snakebite in his sleep, which is the kind of thing that happens out here and is not remarkable except to whoever it leaves behind. She'd been living on the Dietz place since then, doing domestic work to service the debt. Now Harlan was gone, and the debt had transferred with the estate. She said it the way you say things that happen to you, and not because of you, matter of fact. No bid for sympathy, no anger in it that I could hear. Some people who have been through what she'd been through come out with the anger running just under the surface of everything they say, a low current you can always hear if you're listening. She didn't have that. She'd looked at her situation and understood it and was dealing with it. That was the impression she gave. I said, "You know how to cook." She said, "Well enough." I said, "Can you ride?" She said, "Better than most men I've met." I said, "Good. I've got 34 head on summer range that need moving down before October, and 2 of my regular hands left in the spring for a mining outfit in Nevada. I could use a rider who knows what they're doing." She turned and looked at me. The sun was getting low and coming in sideways through the cab window, and she had to squint a little. She said, "That's not domestic service." I said, "No, but it's what I've got." A silence. The road went around a long bend and the hills came into view, brown and gold in the August light, and the trailer creaked behind us. She said, "Does it count toward the contract?" I said, "Every day counts." She looked back out at the hills. She said, "All right then." My place is 7 miles out of town, up against the eastern edge of the valley where the land rises toward the foothills, and you can see the whole valley floor spread out below on a clear day. The house is a good solid house. Stone foundation, thick walls, deep porch on the south side to catch the afternoon shade. I built it right the first time because I intended to be in it a long time. The barn is newer than the house and bigger than I strictly needed, because I built it for what I intended the ranch to become, not what it was when I started. 340 acres of my own, and grazing rights on another 200 to the north. I had come to the valley 11 years before with 40 head of cattle and no particular reputation, and I had built it into something I was not ashamed of, 1 year at a time, and it showed in the place if you knew what you were looking at. She stood in the yard when we drove in and looked at it. A slow, careful look that went from the house to the barn to the corrals and back to the house. She said, "You built this." I said, "Most of it." She said, "How long?" I said, 11 years. She nodded once, didn't say anything more, went to help unload the horses. I had cleaned out the small room off the kitchen I'd been using for tax storage, moved everything to the barn, swept the floor, and put a cot and a chair in there the day before the auction. It wasn't much of a room, but it had a window that faced east and the walls were solid and it was private, which matters more than size in a room of that kind. She looked at it without comment, set her bag on the cot, and came back out to the kitchen. I showed her where things were, the flour and salt and coffee and dried goods in the pantry, the wood pile, the well, the root cellar where I kept the late vegetables. She walked through all of it with the same focused attention she'd given the yard, taking inventory, not asking unnecessary questions. When I was done, she said, "What time do you want breakfast?" I said 4:30. She said 4:30, and that was how it started. She was up before me every morning for the entire time she was there under contract, and I never knew what time she woke because I never heard her. Only that when I came into the kitchen, the fire was always going and the coffee was always on. She ate fast and didn't talk much in the mornings, which suited me. I'm not a morning talker myself. I barely hear what's said to me before the second cup, and I stopped apologizing for that decades ago. We moved the cattle together through September. Just the 2 of us and a dog named Edgar, who was a better cattle dog than he looked, which is not saying much because Edgar looked like a pile of used rope that someone had put a head on one end. He was white and brown with a peculiarly serious expression that he wore through everything including sleep, and he was 11 years old and had been moving cattle with me since he was 8 months, and he knew things about the work that I had never taught him and couldn't explain if someone asked me to. Good dogs are like that. They understand the work from the inside. She could ride, that was plain from the first morning. She sat a horse the way people do when they learned young and learned right, easy and low in the saddle, her weight balanced, reading the animal through her legs and her seat without making a performance of it. No overcorrecting, no undercorrecting, a good eye for where cattle were going before they decided to go there. That's the whole job, that last part. You can teach a person to stay on a horse. You can't teach them to know where the cattle are headed before the cattle know it. Either you see it or you don't. On the 3rd day, we pushed the last of the strays down through the canyon draw. There was one breakaway steer, a brindle who'd been trouble all summer and knew it, and who had been testing the herd management the same way smart cattle always test, looking for the moment where the pressure wasn't. And he went for the brush on the west side of the draw at a dead run when we came around the lower bend. She was already moving before I'd registered which direction he'd gone. She took the roan mare she'd been riding that whole week around the long way at a gallop, went up over the rimrock where the trail cut back through the upper cedars, and came down ahead of the steer on the far side of the brush before he could get into it. He stopped. He looked at her. He considered his options. She held her ground and didn't move and didn't push, and he turned around and went back to the herd. At the end of that day, when we were unsaddling, I said, "You ride as good as anyone I've had out here." She said, "My dad taught me." I said, "He did a good job of it." She was quiet for a moment, working at the cinch on the roan saddle. Then she said, "He did some things right." I didn't push on that. You learn when to let something sit. We ate together most nights. She cooked weekdays and I cooked Saturdays, and on Sundays we mostly ate bread and cold meat and sat on the porch if the weather allowed. She was a plain cook, but she was not a bad one, honest portions, consistent, nothing fancy, which suited me. She didn't talk during meals unless she had something to say, and neither did I. There was one early evening in September. We'd brought the last of the South herd down, and we were both tired. That particular kind of tired you get from a long day on horseback where you feel it in your hips and your hands. And she'd made supper, a beef stew with the last of the summer onions, and we ate it without saying a word for about 20 minutes. At the end of it she said, "The brindle steer." I said, "What about him?" She said, "He's going to be trouble all winter." I said, "He always is." She said, "I want to put him in the smaller east pasture so we can watch him." I said, "That's what I was thinking." We ate the rest of the meal in silence, and then we did the dishes and went to bed, and I lay there in the dark and thought about the fact that we'd had the same thought about the brindle steer, and said it in about 4 words combined and understood each other completely. And I thought about how rarely that happens between 2 people and what it meant that it was happening already. I noticed after a few weeks that the silence between us had a quality I hadn't expected. It wasn't empty, it was company. There's a difference, and it took me some time to identify it, because I'd been living in the empty kind for so long I'd forgotten what the other kind felt like. I am 60 years old. I was married once to a woman named Ruth who died of fever in the winter of 1871. That was 22 years ago. The grief of it doesn't live in my chest the way it did in those first years when it sat there like a stone and pressed on everything. It's not like that anymore. It's the way old breaks are in a bone, healed and mostly gone, but the weather still finds the place sometimes. A particular angle of winter light through a window or the smell of snow coming in off the mountains, and I'll think of her for a moment. It doesn't undo me. It's just a truth about who I am and what I've lost. I had not had a woman in my house since Ruth. I had not tried. I'm not a man who tries things he doesn't believe he can manage, and for a long time I didn't think I could manage it, not the grief. I'd manage the grief. But the other thing, the specific texture of a life shared with someone, the way another person's rhythms and habits and presence reshapes a house and reshapes you. I had decided somewhere along the way that I was past the point of asking that of myself again. Not couldn't, wouldn't. There's a difference. In October, she asked me about the Nevada hands. We were riding out to check the upper pasture fence, the October sun low and cold, the aspens already stripped and bare, and she said without preamble, "The hands that left for Nevada." "What happened?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You get a look when anyone mentions Nevada. I've noticed it for 2 months." I said, "They found better paying work." She said, "That's not all of it." She wasn't pushing at me. She was asking the way she asked most things because she wanted to know, because she'd noticed something real and wanted to understand it. I thought about it for a while, the horses picking their way along the hillside, the cold coming down off the mountains. I said, "Tomas and Abner had been with me 6 years. Good hands, both of them. They left because the mining pay was real money and I couldn't match it. Abner had a wife and 3 kids in Trinidad and the money made sense for his family. Tomas had no family, but he went because Abner was going and they'd come together. It wasn't about me." I paused. But after 6 years it was harder to take than it should have been. She rode beside me for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "That's honest." I said, "It's just what happened." She said, "Most men would dress it up or not mention it at all." I didn't have an answer for that. We checked the fence and found 2 posts down from an elk and set them and rode back in the cold. She didn't say anything more about it, and neither did I, but the conversation had done something, opened a door slightly that I'd kept closed, and she'd walked up to it and looked in without making a production of it, and then moved on, the way a person does who understands that some things just need to be said once. By late October, she was known in town. Not famous, just known, the way people in a small valley know each other, by trade, by face, by what they'd heard. She went into town for supplies every week or two, and she handled the business herself, and I heard from Walker Price, who heard from everyone eventually, that she was not to be underestimated at the feed merchants, and that the man who tried to sell her bad corn in September had not tried that a second time. I heard from the Amadors that she'd helped their daughter-in-law through a difficult labor in early October when the doctor couldn't get there in time, because she'd been at a neighboring ranch that day and they'd sent for her and she'd gone and done what needed doing. I heard this from Amador himself when he came by to thank me, as if I'd had something to do with it. I told him to thank her. He said he had. He said, "Your wife is something." I said I knew that. I want to tell you what it meant to hear her called that, your wife. I had been called a lot of things in 60 years, a rancher, a good neighbor, a fair dealer. All of those meant something and I had worked for them, but that was different. That was her name attached to mine, and it was her she'd earned it on, not some idea of a wife but her. The actual her, the woman who knew the South Trough and the gray gelding and the bad seed corn. And hearing it said by a man I respected in a tone of genuine regard settled something in me that I hadn't known needed settling. A cold snap came in late November and lasted 10 days. The temperature dropped to something I hadn't seen since the winter of '87, and the water troughs froze solid overnight, and the cattle bunched in the lower pasture against the north windbreak and stood in miserable groups with their heads down. We were out every morning before dawn breaking ice, hauling hay, checking the herd for any that were in trouble. It's hard work in that cold. Your hands go numb through the gloves in 20 minutes and the air burns in your lungs, and the sky at 4 in the morning in November is a specific kind of dark that is different from any other dark. She did it without complaint and without theatrics, which is all you can ask of anyone. One morning the stock tank in the far corral cracked clean through. Old tank, the cold had found a seam. Water everywhere, freezing where it spread. I got down in the corral to look at it, and she was up on the fence rail looking down, and she said, "We can patch it with the sheet tin from the barn roof section that came loose in September. I was going to mention you should re-nail that anyway." I said, "You've been looking at the barn roof." She said, "I look at everything." I believed her. I had come to believe it. She read everything around her the same way she'd read that auction yard, systematically, without drama, and she remembered what she'd read. We patched the tank together, most of the morning, cold and awkward work getting the tin into place. When we came in, I made coffee and she made biscuits, and we ate standing at the kitchen counter, because neither of us had the patience to sit down and do it properly, both of us still cold, and it was in that moment, standing there with the biscuits and the coffee, in the warm kitchen after the cold work, that I understood something I'd been avoiding understanding. I was not going to be able to keep treating this as a simple and ordinary situation. I didn't do anything with that understanding. I let it sit. But it was there. In December, I went into town for supplies and ran into Galt at the mercantile. He was buying rope, and he saw me come in, and he said, with the kind of pleasantness that is not pleasant, "How's the indenture working out, Calloway?" I said, "Her name is Calla Marsh, and she's a good worker." He said, "I imagine she is." A pause. He straightened the rope coil in his hands. "I was short by $20, wondered if you knew that." I said, "I didn't count your money." He said, "Didn't figure you did." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who's decided something. "You're 60 years old and you spent money you didn't have on a girl young enough to be your daughter. What do you figure that says about you?" I looked at him. I said, "It says I didn't want her going home with you." I picked up my supplies and left. The conversation sat with me on the drive back, the cold air coming in around the cab window. Galt had said what he'd said to shame, to remind me of the arithmetic, the age, the disproportion of the thing, and it had done its work a little, the way a thing does when it touches something you've already been thinking yourself. I was not immune to the arithmetic. I had been doing it myself since August. But here is what I know about Galt and men like him. They use the arithmetic because they don't have anything else. They don't have the other kind of accounting, the kind that says what a man is made of, what he's built, how he treats the things in his care. They can only count years and dollars, and they call that value. I had been doing a different kind of accounting for 60 years, and I knew what my numbers said. I told Caller about it when I got back, not all of it. Just what Galt had said about the money, that he'd been short by 20. She was at the kitchen table working on a bridle, and she listened without interrupting. Then she said, he was going to underbid me by $20. I said, apparently. She went back to the bridle. After a while she said, I'm glad you didn't know that at the time. I said, why? She said, because if you'd known you could have had everything for 110, you'd have bid 110, and then you'd be worrying now about whether I knew it. I looked at her. She was right. I said, you've thought about this? She said, I think about things. She set the bridle on the table. You paid $130 and you gave up land you needed, and you didn't know you could have done it for $20 less. That's just what you did. There's nothing to think about with it. I said, all right. She picked up the bridle again. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the temperature was going down towards 0, and the wind had come up off the mountain and was working at the eave. I got the lamp lit, and we sat in the kitchen, and it was warm, and outside the cold was doing what cold does. And I sat there, and I thought about what a good person she was, and I didn't say anything about it. I want to say something about loneliness here, because I think people who haven't been alone a long time don't know what it really is. They think it is sadness or isolation, and it can be those things, but the particular kind of loneliness I mean is not those. It is a specific gravity. Everything is a little heavier than it should be. The morning coffee, the sound of your own boots on the porch, the good days and the bad ones and the ordinary ones in between. All of it carries slightly more weight than is warranted. The gravity doesn't hurt. It doesn't announce itself much. You stop noticing it because it becomes the default weight of your own life. And then someone comes into the house, and the weight lifts a little, and you notice with some surprise that it had been there all along, the whole time, every day for 22 years. I noticed it lifting in November, and I noticed it more in December, and by January of 1894 I had stopped pretending I didn't notice. I am not telling you this to make it into something it wasn't. It didn't feel like a story unfolding. It felt like one day and then another day, and then, somewhere in January, a morning when I came into the kitchen and she had her back to me and she was at the stove and the coffee was ready, and she turned and said, "The south pasture water is frozen again." And I said, "I know, I'll go break it." And she said, "I'll come." And I said, "All right." And we went out together into the cold. That's what it felt like. One ordinary morning in a long series of them. And the difference was that I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. She had opinions and she stated them, and she was sometimes wrong, and I told her so, and we argued about land management and the right way to winter a steer, and whether the gray gelding had a soundness problem in his left front or was just being ornery about the cold, and about the proper way to string a fence, and whether the south draw needed a water gap before the spring runoff came. We argued honestly, and neither of us went to bed sulking, and neither of us went quiet with it afterward. She held her positions until she had reason to change them. And when she was wrong, she said so without the long face that some people put on about being wrong, the performance of contrition. She was just wrong, and then she wasn't, and we moved on. I had been doing things alone for 11 years, and there was something surprisingly good about someone in the room who would argue with me when I was wrong. She had decency. That's the word I keep coming back to. Bone deep and consistent and not dependent on an audience. The kind you either have or you don't. It was in early March that I tore up my shoulder. The creek was running high from snowmelt, and a young red Angus I'd bought the previous spring had gotten down in the bank mud on the creek bend where the bank had given way. He was in the water, not drowning, but stuck and panicked and getting more stuck with every lunge. I got in the water after him, which was the only way. The water was cold enough that it made my boots feel like lead. I got a rope on him, and when he lurched away, he took my right arm with him at a bad angle, and something in my shoulder gave that I knew immediately was not going to be a short fix. I got the steer out. The shoulder was bad. I could raise my arm to about chest height and no further, and there was a specific pain with any rotation that let me know I'd done something real in there. She wrapped it the first morning with a length of flannel, tight, and even, the way a person does who's done it before and knows what snug means and what too tight means. She set my arm in a sling she made from a feed sack, and she did this without fuss and without hovering. She said, "You should have the doctor look at it." I said, "It'll sort itself." She said, "It'll sort itself faster if someone who knows what they're doing looks at it." I said, "I know what I'm doing." She said, "I know you do. I also know you've been favoring that shoulder since before the cold snap and you didn't say anything and now it's worse." She looked at me directly. "The doctor." I went. He told me I'd torn something in the rotator, which I'd already figured, and to keep it rested for 6 weeks, which I wasn't going to manage, but I didn't tell him that. He wrapped it tighter than she had and gave me something for the pain and charged me $2. For 2 weeks I couldn't raise my right arm above my chest. I worked with one arm and my left and some workarounds, and some things didn't get done, and that was the truth of it. On the 4th day, she came in from doing the morning feeding, and she set her coat on the hook, and she said, "You need to stop trying to do everything one-armed. Tell me what needs doing." I said, "You know what needs doing." She said, "I do. I want to hear you say it." I looked at her. She was standing at the kitchen table and her chin was up, and she had that direct look she had, and I understood that she was not asking for instructions. She was asking me to admit that I needed the help, and she knew why I was resisting it. You can't live 11 years alone without learning that needing anything feels like a hole in the fence you can't find, the kind that lets things out, the things you've been keeping in. And she'd been watching me long enough to see that. I said, "I need the help." She said, "Good." She did the work, without making it a gift, without any quality of charity to it, without looking at me with anything I'd have had to refuse. She just did the work, the same way she did everything, straightforwardly and without theater. There is a kind of respect in that is hard to articulate. She understood what I needed, and she understood why the admission mattered, and she didn't make more of it than that. The shoulder came right over 6 weeks, as the doctor said it would. Spring came. The days got long again, and the work got big the way it does in spring, the whole ranch shaking off the winter all at once, and we were busy. Side by side most days, the work occupying everything. There are rhythms that develop between two people who work land together. They are not dramatic. They are small and cumulative and practical, who takes which task, how you move around each other in a barn or a kitchen without collision, the shorthand that develops when you've done the same work in the same space long enough. Our rhythm had gotten smooth. Easy. The way long-practiced things get easy without you noticing the practicing. She'd been riding the roan mare she'd arrived with as though the horse had always been hers, and maybe it had been before the estate bundled things. I never asked. The mare's name was Consolation, which Harlan Dietz had given her and which Calla kept. I thought about that sometimes, about keeping a name someone else had given a thing. In May, she turned 24. I didn't know it was her birthday until she mentioned it at supper when I'd asked what had put her in a good mood, and she said, "I'm alive another year." I said, "Congratulations." She said, "Thank you." I got up from the table and went to the box on the mantel. It's a hinged wooden box Ruth had made for me early in our marriage, fitted tight with a good lid. I keep in it things I haven't found another place for: the deed to the property, a few letters, a photograph, and the ivory-handled folding knife my father had given me when I was 14. It was not a working knife. It was a good knife, the kind you keep. The handle was real ivory, warm in the hand, and the blade held an edge without much encouragement. My father had carried it 20 years before he gave it to me, and I'd carried it another 30 and used it rarely and kept it sharp. I put it on the table in front of her. She looked at it and then at me. I said, "A woman working alone ought to have a good knife. You can give it back when the contract's up if you don't want to carry it." She picked it up and turned it over in her hand. She ran her thumb along the edge of the closed blade, feeling the fit of it the way a person does who knows what a good knife is supposed to feel like. She said, "It's a beautiful knife." I said, "I know it is." She folded it and put it in her pocket. I finished my supper and she finished hers, and we washed the dishes in the particular comfortable silence that had become the signature of the two of us together, and I did not think about the contract or the calendar or what any of it meant. Some things you can think about too much and ruin. She found out about the Creek Bottom parcel in June. I think it was Walker Price's nephew at the Mercantile, though I never asked. She came back from town one afternoon with flour and a look on her face that I hadn't seen before, not the flat measuring look she wore most of the time, but something different. Stricken, the way you look when you've been told something you'd been protected from knowing and weren't sure you wanted to know. She set the flour on the table and she said, "You gave up the Creek Bottom parcel." I said, "I suppose I did." She said, that's lot 47, the land along the south draw with Dietz's fencing. I said, that's right. She said, that's the land you went to the auction for. I said, it was. She said, why? I said, because I didn't want you going to Galt's place. She said, you didn't know me. You'd never seen me before that morning. I said, no. But I watched you read that yard, and I watched where you landed when the bidding was settled. And I know what that kind of look means when a person makes it about someone they're going to have to live under. She sat down across from me at the table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at them. She said, you paid $40 you didn't have for a woman you'd never met. I said, I paid $130 for 3 horses I had a use for and a contract I hadn't planned on. She looked up at me. She said, don't. I said, all right. I paid $130 because I didn't want you going to Galt. A long silence. Outside the window, the evening was coming down orange over the West Hills, and there was a nighthawk calling somewhere, that long electric sound they make in early summer evenings, rising and falling. She said, how long were you going to wait before saying something? I said, I don't know that I was going to. She said, why not? I said, because I didn't know if I had any business saying anything. You're 37 years younger than me. You've got a whole life ahead and options I can't compete with, and I'm not about to make a fool of myself over the arithmetic. She was quiet, then she said, I'm not the arithmetic, I'm the person. I said, I know you are. She said, and I know you. I've been in this house 9 months. I know you get up at 4:30 because you've gotten into the habit of worrying about the South Trough, and you'd rather go check it in the dark than lie in bed wondering. I know you can't hear the word Nevada without a look that crosses your face and is gone before most people see it. I know you take the end piece of bread at every meal and leave the middle pieces for me even though I've told you 3 times I don't care which piece I get. She paused. I know you keep your father's Bible on the nightstand and you don't read it, but you won't move it either. She looked at me straight. That's not arithmetic, that's you. I didn't say anything for a while. The nighthawk went on outside. The light came down gold through the window and put a long bar of it across the table between us. And the kitchen had the smell it has in summer evenings, warm wood, and whatever was left of supper. I said, I've got the land and the house and the cattle and whatever I am. 22 years alone builds a man into a certain shape, and it's not a young man's shape. That's not a small thing to ask someone to take on. She said, you didn't ask. I said, I'm asking now. She didn't answer right away. It wasn't a quick answer. She sat with it, both hands still on the table, her eyes on the bar of light between us, and she was quiet long enough that the light shifted, moved along the table as the sun dropped further. I waited. I am a patient man when patience is what's required. I have been patient for 60 years. And then she reached into her pocket and took out the ivory-handled knife and set it on the table between us. She looked at it, then at me. She said, you told me to give it back when the contract was up if I didn't want to carry it. I said, I did say that. She said, the contract's up in 14 months. I said, I know when it's up. She said, I'm not waiting 14 months. She left the knife on the table and looked at me, and I understood what she was telling me. She was keeping it, and she was telling me why. I said, you're sure? She said, I told you I know you. I've known you 9 months, and I know who you are. You do the right thing when it costs you. You don't make your problems other people's. You work hard and you keep your word, and you gave up land you needed for a woman you'd never met because you couldn't stand to watch something wrong happen in front of you. She looked at me without looking away. I know what kind of man that is. I've been looking for that kind of man my whole life, and I didn't expect to find him at 60, but here you are. I picked up the knife and turned it over once in my hand and set it back down in front of her. I said, keep it. She put it back in her pocket. She stood and went to the window and stood there looking out at the evening, and after a while she said, without turning, the creek bottom parcel. When it comes available again, and Solis is having a bad year, I've heard he's thinking about selling. I want you to buy it. I said, I'll buy it. She turned around and looked at me. Then she said, good. We were married in October. The preacher from the valley town came out on a Friday afternoon. Walker Price was there, and the Amadors from the neighboring place to the east, who had been good neighbors for as long as I'd been in the valley and who had watched the summer with the quiet attention of people who live close to you and know something is happening without being told. Cala's aunt from Pueblo had made the 2-day trip and cried steadily through the whole ceremony and periodically during supper, not from sadness, but from what she kept calling long overdue relief. She'd say it to anyone within earshot. Her niece deserved something good. She wasn't wrong about that. We stood in the yard in the late afternoon, the light coming down warm and yellow across the hills, the 3 roans in the corral. Consolation had her head over the fence rail watching the proceedings with the expression horses have when humans are doing things they don't quite follow. Edgar sat at our feet because he went where he wanted, and we'd stopped arguing with him about it before summer was out. The preacher read what he read and asked what he asked, and we said what we said. When it was done, Cala's aunt came and embraced her for a long time and then turned to me and took my hand in both of hers, and she looked at me with the particular look of a woman who has been worrying about someone she loves for a long time and is finally putting the worry down. She said, "You take care of her." I said, "I intend to." She said, "She's taken care of herself long enough." I said, "I know she has. She'll keep doing it. I'll just be there." The aunt looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "That's the right answer." What I want to tell you about that first winter we were married is the ordinary texture of it, because I think it's the ordinary texture that is the actual thing, not the dramatic moments. The dramatic moments are over fast. What you live in is the day after day. We sat evenings by the fire. She with her mending and her reading. She had a stack of books she worked through steadily, reading the way she did everything with her full attention, and me with the ranch paperwork, the land tax notices, the cattle records, the monthly accounts. Sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't. When the accounts were done, I sometimes read the almanac, which I've read every year since I came to the valley and which has never once changed what I actually do, but which I read anyway because it makes the whole enterprise feel accounted for. She teased me about the almanac in January, said it was like reading the weather after it had already happened. I said it was more like having a conversation with someone who understood the problem. She said, "That's either very deep or very simple." I said, "Probably both." She laughed. There was a hard week in February when a storm came in from the northwest and pinned us inside for 3 days. Snow against the windows and the temperature down where you didn't want to be in it longer than necessary. We went out in shifts to check the animals and do the essential work and came back in and thawed out by the stove. On the second day, she found a box of dominoes in the back of the pantry that I'd had for years and never played, and she set them out on the kitchen table and taught me a game she said she'd learned from a Mexican cowhand on a ranch in New Mexico when she was 17. The game had rules I couldn't follow at first, and then they became obvious, the way rules do when someone explains them right. We played for 4 hours that day, and I won twice, and she won 6 times, and she was entirely unsympathetic about the 6. On the third day, the storm broke, and we went out to find 3 fence posts down on the north line, and a ewe that one of the neighboring sheep operations had somehow lost into our pasture, standing by herself in the snow looking profoundly unhappy about it. We put her in the barn, and I sent word to the neighbor, and he came to collect her the next day, and thanked us, and brought a jar of his wife's apple preserves. Cala set the preserves on the shelf and said, "We'll have those in the spring." I said, "Not before," she said. "They'll be better after a few months." I said I'd take her word for it. She said I should. That's a week of a marriage. Not the ceremony, not the declaration. A storm and dominoes and a lost sheep and apple preserves saved for spring. In November, she started reading aloud to me. Not formally, not always, she would just start reading from wherever she was when I'd finished the accounts and had nothing in my hands. The first time she did it, I didn't say anything, just listened, and she read a page and then 2, and then she looked up and I said, "Keep going," and she did. After that, it was a regular thing on the quiet evenings. There is something about being read to. I'd forgotten it. Ruth used to read to me early in our marriage, evenings like this one, the lamp lit and the fire going. When she died, I lost that too, and I didn't know I'd missed it until Cala did it the first time, and something in me that had been drawn tight for a long time let go a degree. She slept on my left side, her hand on my chest, every night. I would wake sometimes in the dark in the particular quiet of 2 or 3 in the morning when the ranch is as still as it gets, and I would lie there and listen. The wind at the eave, the horses settling in the barn, the sound the cold makes against a solid house, her breathing slow and even, her hand warm through my shirt. I am not a man who goes looking for what things mean. I've done enough living to know that meaning comes or it doesn't, and looking for it is mostly a way to miss it when it arrives. But I would lie there in the dark in that first winter, and I would feel the weight that had been on me for 22 years, and I would understand that it was gone. Not absent because I was forgetting something, or because time had finally worn it smooth. Gone because something had replaced it. Not Ruth, I was not replacing Ruth, and I was not confusing what this was with what that had been. Something different, the specific gravity of being known by another person. The weight that comes off when someone sees you, the actual you. The particular 60-year-old man with the 4:30 mornings and the end pieces of bread and the Bible he doesn't read, and stays anyway. I thought sometimes, lying there in the dark, about the lot number on my hand. 47, the smear of the carpenter's pencil where I'd wiped the sweat. I had gone to that auction for a piece of land, and I had come home with the land's worth in debt and 3 horses I hadn't needed and a contract I hadn't planned on. By any accounting, that should be a story about a foolish old man. But I have never once, from that August afternoon to this moment, thought of it that way. Not for a day. Not for an hour. Because here is what I understand at 60 that I didn't understand at 30 or 40. There is a kind of knowing that is faster than thought and truer than reason, and when it moves through you that fast and that sure, you act on it. You don't wait for it to make sense. You step off the roof. Calla knew me. That is what she'd said at the kitchen table, and it was true. She knew the small, particular habits of me without making a catalog of them or using them as evidence of anything. She knew them because she'd been paying attention, the way she paid attention to everything, the same way she'd read that auction yard. She'd read me too, and she'd decided. That is what I come back to. She decided. Nobody and nothing was making her. She had the whole of her life and 37 years of options I couldn't compete with, and she chose this, me, the ranch, the life that was already half built when she came into it, and she chose it with her eyes open, which is the only way anything is worth anything. I know what my worth is. Not in money, that's simple, I can add it up. I mean the other kind. I know what I've built and what I've kept and what I've been in this valley for 11 years. I know what I am, and I've known it for a long time without anyone else knowing it with me. That's the hardest kind of knowing. Where you've done the right thing and nobody was there to see it, and it still mattered because it was right, and you carry that alone. You don't ask for witness, and you don't ask for recognition, and you go on. She saw it. She saw what I was, not the 60 years, not the gray in the hair, not the old break in the shoulder, or the single man's house, or the years of working alone. She saw what I'd built out of the whole of it, and she chose it freely. That's the word. Freely. I can't say it enough. That's the gift. The only gift that matters. The Creek Bottom parcel came available in February, as she'd predicted. Solis sold out, and I bought the land before the estate could bundle it. Good Creek Bottom land. Good fencing. 11 years of Harlan Dietz's labor built into every post. I paid cash this time. She was there when I signed the deed. She read the description of the parcel line by line, every boundary and watershed and easement, the way she read everything. When she was done, she handed it back to me and she said, "There, now you have what you came for." I looked at her. She knew what I was going to say. She smiled, not something she did constantly, but when she did it was real, and she said, "Don't make it more than it is." I said, "All right." She said, "Come on, the South Trough won't check itself." We walked the creek bottom land for the first time together in March, when the snowmelt had the creek running full and the mud was deep in places, and we had to pick our way along the bank. She had her boots in the soft ground and she was looking at the fencing, running her eye down each line the way she looked at everything. She said, "The southeast corner post is healing." I said, "I see it." She said, "We can fix it before the summer stock goes in." I said, "We can." We walked the whole boundary. It took most of a morning. At the end of it, we stood on the high bench above the draw and looked out over the valley and the creek below and the hills on the far side. And it was a good March morning, cold still, but with the quality of air that says the cold is temporary now instead of permanent, and the light was clear. She said, "It's good land." I said, "It is." She said, "Dietz knew what he was doing." I said, "He did." We stood there for a while. The creek was loud below us, running fast with the melt. A pair of red tails were working the thermals above the far ridge, circling without effort. She put her hand on my arm, just her hand resting there, easy and natural, the way she did things, and we stood and looked at the land. I thought about the lot number written on my hand, the smear of the pencil, 47. what I'd come for and what I'd come home with instead. A man could spend a long time arguing with the trade, and I'd decided somewhere in that first winter that I was not going to be that man. The land was good. What I'd come home with was better. We went out into the April morning, the hills gone green from the spring rain, the mountains still white at the top, consolation in the corral watching us come across the yard. Edgar trotted ahead. The air had that particular spring smell, clean and cold, and full of something that was about to happen. She opened the south pasture gate and looked back at me and waited. I went through. The trough was fine,